Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the Humanities Center Tuesday lecture series. It's great to see such a big group today. I'm Hannah Holtzman, the Keck Postdoctoral Fellow in the Humanities Center, and today it is my great pleasure to introduce the third panel in our series, Care for Our Common Home, Environmental Justice and Sustainability Across Disciplines. So I'd also like to just take a minute to thank Noelle Norton, Brian Clack, and Lindy Villa in the Humanities Center for all of the support for and help with coordinating this series of events, as well as Michel Boudrias, who's one of our speakers today, who helped to really shape this series back in the spring. So each week we focus on a particular theme with speakers from the arts, humanities, sciences, and social sciences for a multidisciplinary liberal arts approach to the climate crisis and the urgent challenges that it poses for humanity and for the planet. So this week, Drs. Erin Gross and Michel Boudrias will talk about food justice and sustainability in the context of University of San Diego in particular. So I will go ahead and start. Our first speaker today, Dr. Michel Boudrias, is an associate professor in environmental and ocean sciences, and he teaches courses on environmental issues, sustainability, and coastal environmental science. His primary research area focuses on long-term ecological studies of shallow water coastal habitats impacted by human activities, both in San Diego and in developing countries. And beginning in 2010, he was the principal investigator on 2 National Science Foundation grants dedicated to climate change education for decision makers and key influential leaders, as well as informing San Diego and the nation about the impacts of climate change and how we can work together to find creative solutions to maintain our quality of life for future generations. At the University of San Diego, he was department chair for 10 years, leading the transformation of the department and positioning it as a key player in field-based and applied undergraduate research, integration of courses across multiple disciplines, and sustainability efforts. He was named the director of the Care for Our Common Home pathway in 2019, supporting the University of San Diego's Envision 2024 strategic plan and the Urgent Challenges Collective. And the title of his talk today is Climate Change Impacts on Food Availability, Waste, and Sustainability.
What I'd like to do is basically put this into perspective from a science angle, and then transitioning to some of the human components, and then Erin will take over from there, I think, and bring in a lot of these other dimensions that are important to us. So, as we mentioned, the presentation is focused on the climate change impacts on food availability, on food waste, and how we can live a more sustainable life. When we think of climate change, there are some images that are sort of ingrained in us. Floods that are affecting people's lives and, in fact, displacing them. Polar bears without a place to go as the glaciers have disappeared. Floods in some areas, massive droughts in others. And so the reality of climate change is really there for us to see in front of us. It's also deeply connected to impacts on our food systems. And why is that? Well, first, we know that there's been some major impacts on temperature. If we look at the temperature record from the last 100 or so years, over the 100 almost 150 years, looking at the temperature anomaly, it's very clear that since the 1980s, there's been an increase in average global temperature and the difference between that and the long-term average. And you can also see that the last few years clearly show high values. In fact, if you look at the 10 hottest years on record globally, they've all happened since 2009. Last year was the second warmest year on record. This year is warmer, will probably beat 2019 and maybe even beat 2016. I'm telling you, every time I looked for a graph today, it said warmest year on record, and it was 2014 to 2017, and now we're moving towards our year. In fact, the last 5 years have been the five hottest years ever recorded, and it continues to be a trend that we will see again with 2020, with record temperatures, Death Valley at 130 degrees, for example, but temperatures everywhere around the planet. And this is not a debate. It is very clear that climate change is happening. It's happening now. It's happening everywhere on our planet. At the scientific level, 97% of the scientists and the experts agree that humans are the cause of global warming. Of the 3 scientists that do not, 2 of them are really looking at the very small details and maybe adjusting the concept of maybe higher, a little bit lower, which data should be used. But it's very clear that this is happening. And I want to put this into context because, of course, as academics, we are trained to be critical thinkers. Getting 4 scientists to agree on when lunch is enough challenging enough to get thousands of scientists to make sure that they see that this is what's happening is a very clear statement that the science is unequivocal. And where does it come from? It comes from increases in CO2. This is the Keeling curve. This is from today, so you can go to the Scripps Institution of Oceanography and look at the values of CO2 in the atmosphere at Mauna Loa, the record starting in 1958. It was said several years ago that the tipping point was 350, and we've been averaging over 400 for the last couple of years, and today it's 411 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. This affects atmospheric processes, land-based processes, and ocean processes in a variety of different ways, including ocean acidification. And though I won't spend a lot of time on those aspects, the fact is that most of the heat, over 90%, is going into the ocean, and impacts of ocean acidification and other impacts on temperature in the ocean has a very strong food connection that I will come back to a little later. Now, the big question often is, are we responsible? Is it a human-induced impact? And so let me give you a couple of examples of how we feel that we have the data to support that. If you look at the curve in blue, this would be the model predictions of temperature changes over time from the 1900s to the years 2000. And the blue line is natural variation, increases in volcanic activity, solar flares, and solar activity. The red line is the model taking those natural variations and adding other components created by humans, greenhouse gases, sulfates, ozone depletion. And the black is the data itself. And it's pretty clear that the data clearly supports that humans have added to the natural variation and have caused the increase in temperature on the planet. And that's because there's a lot more humans. And I love this graph for 2 reasons. One, I want to point out that in the right-hand corner where there's a dip in the curve, that's the bubonic plague, which killed off a large portion of humans at the time. And it is a blip on this curve of human population increases because of the insane exponential increase you see. In fact, if you look at 1974 and add 12 years to the total, 13 years, every single 11 to 12 years, we add 1 billion people to the planet. And we are on pace to do this again. We're over 7 billion, and we will closely reach, or rapidly reach, 8 billion people. Our planet is being impacted very much by our activities. So let's summarize that, and a few of you have seen this when I've used this before. In the center in gray and in blue are the physics and chemistry of climate change, where you're actually seeing what's happening from CO2 and the impacts. The 2 other boxes are the human impacts. In orange, what we are doing to the planet, and in red, what's happening to humans as a response to the changes in climate and the impacts to the natural world. And I want to point out that if you look at a lot of these bubbles, you will see some connections to food, changes in agricultural practices, changes in land usage that are affecting deforestation on one side, fossil fuel use, because when we think of food, we also need to move it from one place to another. That is leading to impacts that are affecting the physics and the chemistry. And on the other side of things, what are we seeing? We are seeing more famine, more problems with fisheries, more problems with farming, more problems even leading to environmental refugees. So we know that there's this strong connection between our activities, our way of life, the science of climate change, and the impacts on humans. If we think of, for example, the increases in natural disasters in this year alone, with the fires in California and other parts of the country, with the derecho that hit Iowa, with the multiple hurricanes, we are now using Greek letters because we've run out of the alphabet, by areas of droughts and areas of excessive rainfall. In this year alone, through the end of the month of September, there have been $16 billion natural disasters. So it's the increase in natural disasters, and more importantly, the increase in unpredictability of the weather and the long-term systems has impacts on how we live, but has major impacts on how we eat and what we eat. Think of the impacts to California, to the wine region, to some of the major agricultural components of our state. Think of Iowa and the Midwest, when their crops were totally destroyed. This connection between climate change and increased natural disasters and impacts on food will continue to be something that we need to adapt and deal with in the future. So let's think about what this means. If we increase global temperatures by as much as 5 degrees, and by the way, we're somewhere between 1 and 2 right now, what does it mean for food? It means there may be failing crops in certain areas, particularly in some developing countries. It could lead to yields in some high latitude regions. Some of the excessive warming led to the growing of strawberries in Greenland, for example, but also more failing yields in other places. It also means more unpredictability in water. There'll be some glaciers that might disappear, which means we're changing the water supplies in certain areas. There's going to be decreases in water availability, particularly in places around the world that have a Mediterranean climate, which is parts of Europe, parts of South Africa, and Southern California. Sea level rise, you may think, well, that doesn't have anything to do with food, but it does if it affects the port cities, if it affects the areas where food transportation is key. Ecosystems are being damaged, from the plants themselves to the organisms to the balance. And if you get rid of substantial components of the coral reefs, that is a major source of food for a large portion of the world. And we've already talked about extreme weather events. And the concern is that some of these changes may not recover, and therefore continue to push us in a challenging direction. Just to put this into perspective, a 0.5 degree warming change, and just look at the boxes on the right, we're talking a decline in catches of marine fish, which is the source of protein for over 30% of the world, a reduction in crop yield, especially the major crop yields, maize, soy, rice, sorghum, the ones that are feeding the majority of the population. We're going to lose plants and animals, which means the ecosystems are going to be out of balance. And again, a decline in the coral reefs as a major source of seafood for so many different people. So temperature and changes in the climate have a direct impact on sources of food. We put this in local context, and San Diego is an area that has a lot of small organic farms. In fact, we're one of the major areas in Southern California. We are predicting almost a 5 degree Fahrenheit temperature change by 2050, so it'll be a lot warmer, which affects, of course, crops and the workers, as well as the water use. And we're expecting 16% fewer days of rain, making us even drier than we are now. But when it does rain, we may have floods, which means everything is unpredictable. I'll remind you that about 5 summers ago, we had a rainfall event in the month of July. There was 2 inches of rain in one weekend. That was the equivalent amount of rain that we'd had the previous 100 years combined in that time frame, in those weekends. So we really have this craziness that's going to hit us locally as well as within our state and within our country. So let's connect that to food. What kind of diet? What should we be looking at? How could we be more sustainable, knowing that climate change has impacts? And how will that affect food waste as well? Another impact that is connected to both climate change and to our way of life, right? So we know, we have heard this in previous talks and in other places, that if you have more cattle, there's going to be more greenhouse gases. But there's also an increased demand for meat around many parts of the country. And what they do is they clear land to make it available for livestock, which leads to more methane, nitrous oxide, and CO2. So we're in a cycle where the patterns of growth for more beef is leading to more climate change impacts, which is leading, therefore, to this circular impact as we move forward. In proportions, food as a whole is 26% of the greenhouse gas emissions. Of that 26%, half of that is by animal emissions, and half of that is by beef and lamb only. So clearly we know that that meat as a major source of food has some impacts. But what about other things you might eat? What about your favorite foods? So I want to caution you that the numbers are going to change because it depends on the way they calculate it. This one is per ounce, some of them are going to be per pound, some of them are going to be per kilogram. But in perspective here, it's 106 gallons of water for 1 ounce of beef. But I want to point out that the alternatives that are most commonly used, chickpeas, almonds, and avocados, are also very high water demand fruits. And so we're going to have to be very careful as we propose changes in diets to think about the impacts on the non-meat areas as well. We focus on California. The vast majority of our water is used for animal feed and other things like alfalfa straw for other uses. And the next 5 are all things that are high water use foods, people, residential use. You see that almonds uses more water than humans do. And then rice, grapes, and cotton. We are a major agricultural state. We've also chosen to grow major crops that are very high in water demand in a state that has impacts from drought. What about your favorite foods? Well, if you like chocolate and hamburgers, you're really eating on foods that take up a lot of water in their consumption, and then even your cup of coffee has impacts on what you do. By the way, not surprisingly, unfortunately, we are the #1 consumer of water per capita per year in the world. But I want you to look around in the water footprint, slightly different numbers again. Clearly you see that beef is very high, but dairy also has a high footprint. And actually in some ways surprising, millet and sorghum, which is a major source of food in developing countries. So we see that knowing more and knowing the connection between CO2, water, and climate may allow us to really think carefully about the sources of food and what food we want to eat and what food we want to produce. Another way of looking at it is looking at the ratios. So again, notice that dairy and beef are several times chicken, even more so rice, and even more than any, of course, any of the vegetables that you can think of. I do want to caution you though, when you look up this information, the numbers are all over the place. It depends who's putting them out. So think through what the data mean, first of all. Secondly, look at the other impacts. And thirdly, look at the places where there could be solutions. So in the top graph, they're looking at not only the gallons of water used by different sources of meat, but how much grain is used to feed them and how many pounds of CO2. And it is important to think of the amount of grain that's used to feed your sources of food, because they also will take on other environmental impacts like the use of pesticides, the use of water, and pollution that comes from some of that, and the fact that you're growing grain for an animal, and there's a lot of waste in that process as well. There are some ways of doing it more carefully. So it's important, for example, to see that there are some ways of growing certain types of meat that have lower impacts than others. And in fact, the lowest impact meats in some cases could have less of an impact on the planet from a greenhouse gas perspective than some chocolate, or beef could be even lower than some chicken. That being said, when you look at the bottom of the graph, it is clear that a vegetarian and vegan diet has a much lower carbon footprint on the planet, because even at its worst, it's by far below the low impact. But it is important to think about that if people are going to want to choose a diet that is a mix of different sources of food. I do want to come back to California and its crops, because we grow a lot of crops, pistachios, almonds, avocados, and rice, for example, that are very water demanding, and they will be very impacted by changes to the climate. So if we look here, for example, alfalfa takes the most water, and then it's almonds and pistachios right after that, and rice not too far behind. When you look at the amount of water for one avocado, it's more than 3 times what it takes to grow one apple, and 10 times what it takes to grow a head of broccoli. So a lot of these components of diets that are helpful to you, fats, for example, coming from avocado, or oils and butters coming from almonds, are something to take into consideration when you're looking at the entire package and the entire set of impacts of climate change and food. I'm not going to forget some of your favorite drinks. So it turns out apparently it's better off being a beer drinker than a wine drinker. That seems to have less impact on the water footprint. The type of wine you drink may have more impact, so reds versus whites. If you drink coffee versus tea, tea has a much lower impact, though it turns out that it really depends on where you're getting it, because there's a transportation impact, if it's locally grown, if it's sustainably grown. So again, I would say the best thing to do is become educated in your selections. So what can you do? Well, maybe you can learn a little bit more, right? For example, a cup of tea is almost 5 times less than a cup of coffee as far as water use. A dozen of eggs is half the amount of water used in a kilogram of pork, or almost half of a kilogram of chicken meat. Just as an example, eating the apple instead of the apple juice is almost, again, 3 times less of a water signature. So don't be afraid to drink good tap water, or if you filter it, don't necessarily get big bottles of water. We know that's a problem. Eat more natural foods. And very importantly, think of eating more local sources of food. Though I've talked about CO2 signatures and water signatures for the food, I haven't focused too much on the transportation piece, which in and of itself has a big impact on the CO2 for whatever product it is that you're consuming. I want to transition to the fact that we're also very inefficient in what we do with our food. Food waste alone is about 10% of all greenhouse gases on the planet. And humans are horrible at food waste. We waste anywhere between 1/3 and 40% of food. It's about 1/3 of food that's been purchased, and it's another 10% or so for food that is thrown out before it's even been consumed. And the worst is actually root crops, fruits, and vegetables. And part of that is our obsession with pretty and beautiful things. You're not going to eat a crooked carrot or a spot on your avocado. And this is something that can be changed and really thought through more carefully. And I want to give kudos to the university, who's actually spent some time trying to purchase vegetables that are not perfect in order to be able to still consume them. So we need to think about ways to reduce our food waste. If you think about food waste, it's 8 or 10%. It's demands of area that we use that we don't grow food in. 25% of the food, of the water we use, goes to waste, right? And when we look at the food choices we make, we should be looking at not only the amount of CO2 it takes to grow it and the amount of water, but the amount of waste that comes with that, which allows us to determine, for example, are there better ways of balancing your diet and your choices so that there's less waste? Are there things you personally can do and your organization can do to reduce its food waste signature? This is particularly important as we move to the future with potential 9 billion people on the planet. There's a lot of food resources available. We're just really bad at distributing them, and we're really bad at throwing it away. Just think that 24% of the calories that are produced are never consumed, that 198 million hectares are used to produce food that's not consumed, that the average American family wastes $1,600 a year. That's a month's rent. That's something to consider when you go through how much people do not use their food, how we may not purchase food because it doesn't look just right. So there needs to be some major changes in our attitude in food waste, because this has an impact that's even worse if you think about it, because you've got all the signatures of CO2, all the water signatures, all the climate impacts, but it's not even getting to humans, right? So I want to end with a couple of things. One is, what can we do on campus? This comes from a class that Julia Cancer, Mark Woods, and I taught a few years ago. And the students were asked to come up with ideas. This is just one of the posters on food waste with some general information that I already shared. What's going on campus, or what was going on campus, what prevents us from getting things done, the fact that we are doing some things, and in fact now we have a potential to collect waste from events, people can get to food. We have to continue, however, being leaders on campus, and I know Aaron's going to talk a little bit more about, as an institution, what can we do. So let me give you my science conclusion and then move on to a transition to Aaron's presentation. I think the science conclusion is eat more veggies. And eat more veggies for a couple of reasons, but one of which is it encourages farmers to grow more veggies. And what does that mean? Well, it means our soil quality will get better. It means that we'll reduce our emissions and reduce our water consumption. So that will be good for the planet as a whole. If it's done right and it's done with the proper support, we can reduce our costs. We can decrease our waste, which means we'll be using more of the food that we produce. It's going to lead to healthier, cheaper food for more people. It's going to allow us to actually have cleaner water and actually use space for other reasons than just cattle or other things. We need to think in a more holistic perspective. But I want to make sure we don't forget that there's a people component to the equation, and I'm sure Aaron's going to pick up on this. That is, food and climate and people are tightly connected. There are certain reasons that we use certain foods during important celebrations, or for a celebration where you're moving into a village. We've had students who've done Peace Corps work, for example, who were vegetarians but were offered the goat that was sacrificed by the family for because they were celebrating news. How do you deal with that cultural connection? I'm not the expert, so I'm not even going to touch it too much, but we know that there are religious connections to food that are very deep. There's also some social justice pieces we can't forget. We can talk all we want about making sure we have better choices, but there are some major problems with food deserts in communities that can't get that food. There are changes in our own backyard. There are changes that developing countries could be in a situation where they cannot be in that position. And in some countries, livestock and the growing of livestock is a way out of poverty. It's a way of actually doing more for their advantages. And so we have to be very sensitive culturally. But what's the lesson? Can we do it better? Can we grow more produce organically for the world? Can we take our land and deal with it better? Can we share our knowledge? Can we reduce our costs? And I think the answer is yes. And the answer is we really have no choice, because no matter what we do, it's going to be for the right reasons, and the planet will do better if we take care of it the right way.
So our second speaker today, Dr. Aaron Saul Gross, is an assistant professor in the Theology and Religious Studies Department here at the University of San Diego, and founder of the food and farming advocacy group Farm Forward. Dr. Gross's work on food has been featured in numerous venues, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and most recently, The Guardian. Gross is the past president of the Society for Jewish Ethics and the co-founder of the American Academy of Religions, Animals, and Religion Group. Gross is also the author of numerous academic publications, including The Question of the Animal and Religion, Theoretical Stakes, Practical Implications, published by Columbia University Press. And the title of his talk today is Can University Food Become an Anti-Oppressive Practice? Introducing the USD Food Studies Initiative.
So great to see everybody here. Great to see students in my class, but also others I don't know. And I'm really a special thanks to Dr. Boudrias for his presentation, which really does make mine a lot easier. I counted on Dr. Boudrias throwing more numbers at you than you knew what to do with, and also making them intelligible and clear. And I'm really going to move in the other direction. I'm deliberately, and this is honestly the first time I've spoken about food and not had a couple statistic slides, but I really wanted to try to focus on the bigger picture issues. I think this is maybe the most salient thing we can do in the kind of limited time we have here. So as Hannah shared, my title is Can University Food Become an Anti-Oppressive Practice? Which is kind of a weird title. It's weird for a couple reasons, but we don't typically think of food as something tied with oppression. Even if we think about food as a problem, we tend to use words like pollution or cruelty or worker abuse or this kind of thing. But I want to suggest oppression and oppressive is actually a really helpful term here, and the presentation will explain what I mean. So food is incredibly powerful. Hopefully you got a good sense of that from Dr. Boudrias' presentation, but a lot of that was looking at how food is impacted by climate. What we really got is, a cycle in two directions. And I really want to emphasize on the direction in terms of we eat in a certain way, and that shapes the planet in a certain way. This is just one of the really basic facts about eating, which are easy to forget. I mean, I think fundamentally what I'm talking about is a kind of challenge to our moral imagination, the way in which we conceptualize what food is. Somehow, when we look at our plates, we don't see a great issue of justice. I was listening just at the end here to Dr. Boudrias, and his very modest suggestion, eating more fruits and veggies, but then the benefits he's listing are astonishing, right? These are world-changing benefits, and it's just this tiny little change. And it's sometimes hard for us to grasp that that's kind of the nature of the world we live in. Since we eat by the billions, us humans, when we make changes in how we eat, it literally changes the planet. Grasping that is a scientific challenge. And hopefully Dr. Boudrias' presentation gave you a sense of why that is so. how we and the animals on the planet and our food systems shape things. But this is also a challenge to our moral imaginations. Can we really grasp this as an ethical challenge? When we think about pollution, in general, this is the image that comes to our minds. This is actually, in my Google search, the very first image that comes up if I search for pollution. It'd be interesting to see. Folks can test that out on their own. But when I search for pollution, like the whole first Google page is thus smokestacks. That's the way we think about it. We kind of think about the world as being kind of threatened by these big factories and big corporations that, you know, these smokestacks symbolize. And indeed, that is part of the issue. But I want to suggest that it's much more than we normally think about food, and not just our food, but particular types of food. So if I were to pick an image instead of the smokestacks, that would be the image of pollution that would help us think about it. I would choose this one. So the little black specks on your right are cattle. The big red splotch is the manure lagoon. And I love that the industry calls them lagoons. That's one of the most peculiar phrases I've ever said. Lagoon makes me feel like I should, you know, bust out a beer and relax. But whatever you want to call that thing, it's such weird colors because the density of waste alters the microbiome, and you get these weird bacterial blooms that actually are quite beautiful from several thousand feet up. Though industry shapes our world profoundly, a third of the land on the planet that is arable is occupied by livestock and the crops we use to grow livestock. This is just a unique level of impact on our planet when we look at food. We live on a planet that is a farm, and how we farm shapes that planet. Now, I said a moment ago, not all food is equal. And there's lots of nuances to pay attention to. And I know how dizzying it is to kind of try to keep track of the latest information on what foods have the most impact. And ultimately, we do need to do that. But as promised, I'm just going to focus on big generalizations. And I'm repeating one you already saw. Animal agriculture has a disproportionate kind of impact. So the first of three little points I want to try to make in the next couple minutes is that animal agriculture shapes the planet. It shapes it for better or for worse. Different forms of it shape it differently, different quantities of it shape it, but there's no way around our planet being kind of determined in part by the way in which animal agriculture will flow. Let me give you an example of what I mean. That is my closest to data-driven slide. So this is a quote from the Eat Lancet Commission on Food, Planet, and Health. The commission states very clearly that global decarbonization is necessary. Emissions must be halved by 2030, and net zero carbon emissions should be achieved by 2050. This is essentially the image of pollution as the factory, but they do not stop there. They did the math and found out, according to their analysis, that even if all these goals are achieved, but dietary patterns see no shift, the world will fail to meet the Paris Agreement. And many would argue that the standards of the Paris Agreement don't go far enough. I want you to grasp how substantial that is. You might be thinking, you know, the next president of the United States is going to have a big impact on the environment. Well, if we get somebody in office who will address climate change, and that happened in every other country in the world, and they all started to fix industry and deal with transportation and address all of those issues, but they didn't do anything in terms of addressing diet. They just let current dietary trends continue. It still wouldn't be enough. And I will translate for you when they talk about changes in dietary changes. What they mean is increases in consumption of animal protein, more of human protein coming from animals and less of it coming from plants. So if animal agriculture is so influential, the question becomes, what kind of animal agricultural system do we have today? And this brings me to my second point. Animal agriculture today is dominated by something called factory farming. Now, at this point, factory farming is a kind of household word. So we have some basic knowledge that there's a kind of form of farming. Often we associate it with caged animals. That has problems associated with it. And if you poll Americans, the Pew Commission did this, Americans have very negative associations with the phrases factory farming, industrial farming. We know something is up. And we could spend a lot of time trying to clarify what we mean by factory farming or industrial farming, but I'm going to be really simple today. I'm just going to say quite simply that the essence of the factory farm system is that it is an oppressive system. What I mean by that is quite simply, it looks out on the world, it sees animals, it sees plants, it sees people, and it just asks how it can use them for its benefit. And that's precisely what it does. This just explains the behavior of what these corporations are doing. They have no interest in anything but following their own agenda. And they have no interest in protecting the ecology. And when I say no interest, I don't mean bad people, right? I'm not talking about human beings here. I'm talking about corporations that have structures and demands that are put upon them so that they behave in ways no human being would behave. They're the ones who control agriculture, and they have implemented a rather shocking system. So I've now made a huge claim, and I'm not going to be able to fully back it up. You're going to have to investigate and make up your own mind. But I want to try to make it intelligible with a story. So instead of data, I'm going to go for a story. So we know that animal agriculture pollutes or sickens our air, our water, our soil. We could get into all of those details. That would be enough of a talk there. It is also changing the nature of life on this planet. And so I have there, it's affecting terrestrial life. Now that may seem a little grand. I mean, what I mean is it's affecting, all the farmed animals. Well, there's not such a difference anymore. So if I look at mammalian biomass on the Earth today, if I had all of the mammal species and what they weigh, and I put that on one side of the scale, and on the other side of the scale, I put human beings and the mammals that we eat. Not even all the animals we eat, just the mammals we eat. The human side of that will be not more than 90% of the biomass. All wild animals combined are less than 10% of the mass. If we move to birds, we're going to see a similar thing, not quite so dramatic. But if I combine all the bird species on the planet and weigh them against the birds that we're eating, I'm going to again see that the farmed are about 3 times as much. So this is when we talk about farming animals, like this is life on the planet in a very significant way. This is massive parts of animal life. I'm not even going to get into ocean life, but we have a similar kind of dynamic emerging there. The oceans are just much bigger and we haven't been exploiting them as long. And of course, this disrupts the microbiome. And we are experiencing that in a rather spectacular way right now with COVID. So in case my implication is not clear, absolutely, COVID is an indirect, I do have to use the word indirect, but an indirect result of industrial farming. Those wet markets that got so much attention, and they definitely deserve part of it, exist because factory farming has displaced people. And that's been the alternative that government has suggested to people since they've forced them out of animal agriculture by creating, you create one of these big pork or chicken factories and, a small number of people can produce what previously took hundreds and hundreds of farmers. Right? This is why we have wet markets. This is why we have the kind of dive into the wilderness. It's really driven, I would argue, by factory farming. But I actually don't want to talk about any of that. I want you for a moment to not think about all of that. I just want you for a moment to think about what happens when we live in a world where the water and the air is constantly being polluted and the animals are constantly being poisoned, when our microbiome is being disrupted. Who pays the price for that? Now, you may be thinking you don't see a lot of evidence for this in your day-to-day observations. It's because most of us are probably in some position of privilege, and so we don't see it. Oh, hold on a moment. Go back to my slides. So the question I'm just asking is, so when these things are polluted or sick, who's going to pay the price? And I'm asking you to logically unfold the answer. And I think you'll quickly come to the fact it's going to be who's ever vulnerable, whoever can't get out of the way. And in the US, that will end up being overwhelmingly people of color. And my strategy for illustrating this, beyond the very general kind of observation I'm making here, is going to be to talk a little bit about the impacts on slaughterhouse workers. What you see on the right of your screen is what showed up when I just Googled COVID slaughterhouse deaths. This is something I researched rather intensively a couple months ago, but the story is constantly changing. You can see there's 75,000 results. Obviously, not all of those are going to be legit articles, but there's a lot to wade through. And I want to use this as just a kind of window into this system. But basically, what I am arguing is that when we talk about pollution, when we call something pollution, it is usually because it's having negative impacts on humans in some kind of way. That's usually why we call it pollution in the first place. So it's very important to recognize it's not so much that like occasionally pollution ends up affecting people of color and we call it environmental racism. That's the rule. All of this sickness and cruelty tends to fall on certain human beings. So this is why I want to call it oppressive and not simply use some of the other words we've used. So the promised story, which will come close to, and then I'll just say a little bit about the Food Studies Initiative, kind of hopeful note to end on, and we'll wrap it up. So I don't know who followed this story. We discussed it a little bit in my class, but I'll kind of walk folks through it. So we had, as COVID started, a phenomenon of people going to supermarkets and buying a bunch of things that they wanted to have around. And one of those things that people bought up off the shelves, there was no shortage in supply, was meat, right? So we had meat swept up off the shelves. It created a little public discussion. Started to be rumblings about, are we going to have a meat shortage, which by the way is incredibly hard to happen in America because we have like insane stockpiles of meat for just that purpose. So we never even came close to a meat shortage. This is important because many of you may have heard a narrative that really was about this threatening meat shortage, this threatening food system breakage. And that story was there. It was very much generated by industrial farming. So here's what happened. As COVID started to become serious, workers at slaughterhouse plants stopped going to work. The jobs were too dangerous for them to go. Now that's saying something because slaughterhouse jobs are pretty crappy jobs. They have the highest turnover rate and the highest injury rate of any job in the nation. Or sometimes they're number two, but they've never been in my life lower than number two, either number one or number two. These are terrible jobs. People are only taking them if they are forced into them. And yet they're not going to work because things are getting that bad. This is why meat plants started to close. They couldn't get the workers to show up for work. That's significant. It wasn't that meat plants in general saw that their workers were in danger and closed them. They tried to keep them open, but workers were calling in sick, not showing up. It made it very difficult. So they weren't sure how to get their profits back up and running. Again, no meat shortage in sight. Eventually that would happen, but not yet really in sight. So what they were concerned with really was a legal issue. And so they went to President Trump and they explained it. There was a meeting, several large poultry companies were the kind of principal representatives, and they explained to President Trump the problem. They said, President Trump, we're perfectly happy to strong arm our workers and get them to work. We have all sorts of techniques to do that. These people don't have any other choices. I can just go to them and say, unless you work today, I'm not going to give you work for the next couple months. We have all sorts of things we can do. We know how to get these folks back to work. But, we can't face the legal liability. Once if I force somebody to come to work after they've expressed concern about their safety, and then, they die of COVID, this could be a major lawsuit. Now, this is an industry which is already used to 1 or 2 limbs being lost a week. That's the average in the slaughterhouse. So that's just built into the business calculations, paying off the 1 or 2 people who lose their limbs and dealing with the insurances that associate with that. But deaths were too high. They couldn't afford to be killing people. They wanted to kill people, but they couldn't afford the liability. I find this amazing. They sit down with Trump and they explain it, and Trump decides he is going to order the slaughterhouse workers back to work. Now, this may look like a really cynical interpretation of something that our president did. It's not an interpretation. This is how he described it. So he walked out of the meeting, announced it, and said, "I've solved the liability problem." You can go back and look at the video footage. "I have solved the liability problem." This is what he meant. Now, here's the real kicker. I wish this were a Trump is terrible story. I wish this were a Trump is terrible story. It's not. If Biden were president, I'm pretty sure he would have done exactly the same thing. This is an oppressive system. This is what it is, kind of up and down. There are people resisting it. There are really, really good people trapped in the system. But the system is an oppressive system writ large. And think about how far we've gone. I mean, I didn't expect to see this in my lifetime. I mean, I knew that people were ready to put humans in harm's way to produce meat, but I didn't think we would have a US president openly ordering people back to slaughterhouses when the only reason they weren't going was because the slaughterhouse themselves said, "We don't have the ability to prevent the spread of COVID." You know, they didn't say this publicly, but they knew they didn't have the ability to prevent the spread of COVID. If they had the ability to prevent the spread of COVID, they would have never closed their factories in the first place. So they knew with absolute certainty people were going to get sick and die. They knew there wasn't a meat shortage, and this is the thing that happened. That's insane. That can only happen when many, many things are broken in a system. The system was broken long before COVID. The narrative about it breaking as a result of COVID is a little bit silly and has a very clear beginning. It began not in news reportage. It began with paid, full-page ads in the New York Times by a meat company. That was the narrative of our meat system breaking. Its origins, that's where it began. What we have is a fully oppressive system that is kind of operating the way it has always operated. And this is all pretty depressing stuff. This is our food system. But the real significant thing is it just doesn't have to be this way. It could be exactly the opposite. Food could be creating aggressively positive change in the world. That is, we don't have to settle for just a little bit less cruelty or a little bit less climate change. I would go for those. What we can get is incremental change. I'm all for it. But we really don't have to settle for that. Food is something in our hands. People can change the food system. And it's very hard to do as individuals, but we're never only individuals. And right now, I'm pretty sure everyone I'm speaking to is a part of the University of San Diego community. Now, you and I as individual consumers, we can make certain choices and it can have some influence, but it will only go so far. Institutional buyers can really change stuff. Institutional buyers can create entirely new supply chains, get farmers to have different practices. If you do it in a disciplined way over years, there is nothing you can't change about how you get your food. So this is the inspiration for what I will close with, which is the USD Food Studies Initiative. So this is just getting going this semester. We have funding for at least the next 2 years. This is currently a conversation among faculty. As of a meeting yesterday, we have 20 faculty who are participating in this, and it'll be open to students soon. It'll involve a series of events, a series of discussions. It will aim to create a food studies minor, but most importantly, we want to have a discussion and decide more or less as a community what our values are, and then implement those values in terms of how our food is produced. This is from our mission statement. We want to shape the USD campus into a model of how universities can leverage food scholarship. That's what the professors will largely deal with, and food services, which is everybody's business, to build community on and off campus and establish more engaged and ethical foodways. And this is indeed as open-ended as it sounds. There's a lot of different ways to engage food, to transform our world, to address justice, and we're interested in all of those. But I also want to let you know there are certain particular ways the food industry influences that we already have a critical mass of people interested in. So I'll close with those. Areas of special interest that have already been identified include utilizing food as a vehicle to analyze and respond to racism, especially anti-Black and Indigenous racism, colonialism, food sovereignty, climate change, violence to animals, and my personal favorite, the ways in which all of these issues often intersect in the question of food. Thanks so much for your attention. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Gross. So we will now take questions from anyone. If you want to either put up your blue hand in the participants area, or you could type your question in chat and we will take them that way. So it looks like we have a question, Morgan Clavet.
Yeah, hi. I had a question for Professor Gross, and actually two. How would you suggest that we encourage people to change the way they eat, or like what do you think would be most effective, other than like policy, if that ever happened?
Yeah, no, thank you for that that question. As you can guess, it's something I've thought about. So one of the things that I'm really excited by right now is looking at defaults, right? The thing we eat when we're not really deciding. Very often we go right towards the hardest things. We're like, but what, you know, if I let's say you want to stop eating factory farm poultry. Well, what am I going to have for Thanksgiving? We go right to the most challenging moment. But I'm very interested in the kind of easiest moment when, you know, we're just walking in, grabbing something, probably very influenced by what's at the front of the line, or when we're going to a conference and, you know, we see that they have some kind of meal and we just accept whatever the default is. So this it turns out insanely powerful. I will quickly flash a slide here to give you an example of what I mean. Did I share what I wanted to share? Yeah. Okay. So one of the universities that my organization has been working with is Harvard, and they've done a little bit of documentation of what happened in, you know, there's a very small context, this is less than 50 people. But when they changed the default from, you know, your standard meat meal, whatever the caterer recommended as the standard default, they switched it so that the vegetarian meal was the default and you had to opt in to get the meat meal. And that led to a 43% increase in vegetarian meals. No complaints, nobody who wanted the meat meal was denied it. Here's a similar study that, you know, again, this is kind of small emerging research. I'm not as, you know, don't take these numbers to be definitive. Just promising initial experiments. But here we saw an 80% increase. This was looking at simply with conferences. So changing defaults would be a way I would look at it. And so this is a communal. There's, you know, I could have answered that question in terms of individuals, but looking at how our institutions present and serve food and asking them to change the defaults in ways that will spontaneously alter our food is my kind of most exciting idea these days. So thanks for that.
What I'd like to add to that, and that's actually something I hear all the time when I'm talking to the people in auxiliary, for example. And my son is a chef, so they work there, so I know a lot about how they deal with their food and their catering. There's an impression that there's not that many vegetarians or vegans within the community at USD. And I know, talking to my students, that that's not true. But the fact is we don't have the data on campus. And so because that's the case, they'll call it out, and because it's not a default, they'll call it out and only 10% will say they want a vegetarian option. And so the mindset at the preparation stage is, well, we're only going to get 10 or 15%. I'm not going to make 50% vegetarian because people won't eat it. So in addition to, I think, the changing of the default, we need to be really good at getting systematic data across this and really be able to point out that, you know, even though I may want to eat meat, if I'm at an event and it's mostly vegetarian, I'm fine. So why not have a situation where you've changed the perspectives? But it means changing the system. And that's why, Aaron, I liked your discussion. It's a system problem. It's not just an individual problem. So remember when I showed that food waste poster that our students did, a lot of it on campuses or in communities is that the perception is there that you need to have it a certain way. And I think we need to flip the world upside down. But we need it both from a affective part, how it affects you as a person, but we need the data to back it up, so that it becomes very hard for them to say, I don't want to do that. And by the way, if we're going to save money on the other end, they should be doing it even for that reason alone, let alone all the other community and health and planetary benefits.
Thank you. So just a follow-up question. It looks like someone in the chat has sort of a related question.
I had another question. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Go
if
ahead.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Also, Professor Gross, you said that factory farming normally has like a bad connotation. And do you think farming fish, isn't farming fish probably better than fishing the oceans? Like, or do you think there is a bad connotation of doing that as well?
So again, really complicated topic. I'll just say one kind of thing that will give a picture of some of the things I've thought about in terms of that question. I'll also say I want to agree with Dr. Boudrias about this importance of getting numbers. And one of the things we'll be doing with all the events that are associated with the Food Studies Initiative is we'll be ending them with some kind of polling, some kind of opportunity for y'all in the audience to express your views. And that polling will form data that will ultimately be brought. One of the things we should probably have a discussion about is precisely about this, is about fish farming and where we get our sea animals from and what we want to do there. Here's what I've learned. There was a lot of promise and a lot of genuine belief that fish farming could reduce impact on the oceans. That belief was predicated on the assumption that they could market vegetarian fish. By vegetarian fish, I mean fish that eat vegetables. If you are dealing with a carnivorous sea animal, like salmon or shrimp, which I use because I believe they're number one or two in terms of consumption, but they're definitely right at the top. These are carnivorous animals. So with farmed salmon on average are fed 5 pounds of wild salmon for every pound they put on, right? So for every 1 pound of farmed salmon, I have to have 5 pounds of fish hauled out of the oceans and turned into, not this fish with sea animals, turned into feed. So what we actually have with fish farming is a technology which could be lower impact, but is not, and it is not really showing optimistic signs in that direction. My sense is that much of the language around fish farms being a solution is naive and driven by industry. It's technically possible, but there's no evidence it's been happening. This is about a 50-year-old discussion. So people have been raising your question since the 70s and talking about this. And it's, so far everyone agrees it's been a failure. So far it's very clear fish farming has a massively increased impact on the oceans.
So let me use my marine biologist hat to even add to that in some ways. There's actually been research that's been done, and part of it, by the way, is because of the policies in the US. Fish farming in other countries has been better in working on what they can actually eat. Though there are some problems with pollution, which is another whole aspect in fish farming that we can get to. But I'll give you an example. We had a student who was studying which kind of fish meal to give to white sea bass in Carlsbad. And one of the diets they had chicken as part of their meal. And I'm like, and I said, this may sound like a silly question, but if you're selling fish to people who are pescatarians, if they want it to be their only source of non-vegetarian food, but that the food that the fish is eating is meat, now you have a non-vegetarian fish being fed to someone who just wants to be pescatarian. That's one side of it. The other part is you're growing chicken to grow fish, which is a really bizarre thing if you think it from that perspective. So the technology is there. There are some improvements going on. There's been a lot of research in aquaculture. There's been a massive increase in aquaculture because we have damaged the marine free ecosystem so much more. We're back to the same statement I just made before, which is we need a systemic change because some of the policies are actually preventing us from doing aquaculture in a way that actually would be more sustainable, that would be doable, that would have less impacts on the environment and a more a more reliable source of food for people. So there's a lot of work in that. Actually, I'm just putting a proposal with some colleagues on looking at seafood supply chains and the social justice pieces that are connected to that as well. So it's a solution, but right now it's not a good one.
Thank you.
So there's a related question that I received in the chat here. If we culturally shifted to consuming mostly plant-based diets and hypothetically we were to be confronted with another pandemic, wouldn't factories producing plant-based alternatives like the Impossible Burger be faced with the same problem? Can't a plant-based culture be equally as oppressive if these foods are being demanded by large operations such as university dining? So kind of continuing with this question of processed foods, right?
Yeah, so well, we actually have data on this, and it's not been a problem. Beyond Meat, Impossible Burger, not slaughterhouse hotspots. What I probably didn't say, I was assuming some knowledge, is that slaughterhouse towns have been hotspots in the US and the globe for COVID, right? So yeah, the evidence is no, they didn't have a problem. They're set up differently. These are really different companies. You know, the average worker in the slaughter industry, and this is partly how we have chicken that's so cheap, because there's a lot of processing involved in producing chicken, are just among the most exploitable populations on the planet. That's by design. That's their business model. Beyond Meat just hasn't adopted the same business model.
So one thing to add to that from the university perspective, and it's something that I think our university needs to share more. We've actually done some things working with local farmers and local organic farms. In fact, we are one of the first universities to buy UBUs, which is ugly but useful fruits and vegetables. So if you think about it, if you're making guacamole, if you're making salsa, does it really matter if the tomato is misshapen or that the avocado shell has brown spots on it? And so we have done those kinds of things. And so I think, again, what we need to do is make that not the exception, but the default. It needs to be what we do. We look for ways to be more sustainable and we look to work with more local farms. One of the big issues that the university has as a whole, though, is a volume issue. So let's say they wanted to get only organic tomatoes and they need to buy, 5,000 tomatoes. Can they get that from a local farm? How does that work out? So we do need to look at all the components. So that's a social justice piece, there's a climate piece, there's a business piece, there's even an engineering piece that comes into play, right? A system design piece. And so one of the examples we discussed was maybe you set it up so that the university is the place where a bunch of small farmers come and deliver their material. And so you don't get 5,000 tomatoes from one farmer, you get 500 tomatoes from 10 farmers. Right, just using that as a kind of an example. And so there are ways for us to mitigate some of these issues if we change the way we bring things to campus and we work with locals. And there has been some success stories.
I'm sorry, I'm just going to add one thing, because there was something in that last comment that was really important. There's nothing that automatically about a plant-based meat company makes that an ethical company. And indeed, there are problems. So to give you an example of something where I think the force of the question would make sense, if you look at, so the plant-based meat companies all have highly centralized models. That is, they create very, very efficient plants. They pump everything into the plant, they pump out the product, they ship it everywhere. This doesn't do much for local economies. So if you're looking at some of the situations in the developing world where they're trying to keep a lot of people employed, the problem, the fact that plant-based meat is so efficient is actually something that works against it. So I don't want to say that there's a lot of enthusiasm about plant-based meats. I think it's partly justified. But if the force of the question was, are these companies automatically part of the solution? I want to kind of agree with it and say, no, they're not. Even though in the particular case of comparing slaughterhouses to meat production, we can give the plant-based companies credit.
Michael Chung.
Yes, I had a quick question. So I noticed on Dr. Boudrias' slide about rabbits and how there wasn't any data on how much water that would take. From my understanding from previous courses, correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't rabbits, they have a lower environmental impact than chickens, correct? Do you think they'll ever be Sorry, yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go ahead. They do. There's an interesting perspective, though, and that's one of the other things that we have as humans. We have attachments to animals and plants, mostly animals, in a different way. So a year ago, during Earth Month, the San Diego Union Tribune had a series of 6 articles on alternate sources of protein, including Beyond Meat, and one of them was rabbits. And they got the most negative press they ever had, and actually had to apologize and pull out any discussion of eating rabbit because they're too cute. And I'm saying this, it came out, it was incredible. Like, you can't do that, you know. So you're right. If you look at it from an objective scientific perspective, and you look at what's causing less CO2 and all of that, the rabbit is more efficient than the chicken. But rabbit is not a common food in North America. It is in parts of Europe, but not in North America. And it does have the cute and cuddly component to it that changes how we think about food.
All right, thank you. I was just wondering, because I know you said it's not very common in North America, and I mean, no one ever really comes across eating rabbit, but do you think ever in the future there'll be a time where America, like the United States, will get over that emotion of eating rabbits?
You know, it's an interesting, I had a colleague of mine, we met on Saturday, and he was pointing out that there's a law on the books in Boston that you can't give prisoners more than 3 pounds of lobster per week. And that's because lobster was thought to be this big, ugly insect, and who would want to eat lobster? So can there be a change over time of how we think about food? Absolutely. I think we just need to be in a position to make the decision based on your scientific perspective, your ethical perspective, your cultural perspective, and wrap that all together to make your decision.
Thank you.
Isabel Zakim.
I kind of wanted to go back to the Impossible Burger and the Beyond Meats, and that kind of switch in the way that people have started to eat what they call as protein, or we're assuming it to be as kind of a substance for protein. Do you think that like our community is going to start to embrace that more than meat, or do you think meat is going to always be, or protein, like raw protein, is always going to be the most dominant form of food?
Well, it's a great question. It's one for, you know, those of you who are in religion and animals, I think is kind of there in Jonathan Ford's book, Eating Animals, right? He's reflecting on why we're attached to this. So I don't know what will happen, but I know it is a cultural shift. So for example, before Beyond Meat became insanely successful in 2018 and, you know, biggest IPO of the year, and everybody now knows it's marketable. Before that happened, I had an opportunity to speak with the CEO, who was quite nervous at the time. This is when they were releasing what was called like the Beast Burger or something, which preceded the Beyond Burger. And he was laying out what he saw the challenge of his company. And he's like, I'll be able to duplicate the taste perfectly soon enough. And it's amazing right now. I'm not at all worried about getting my costs down. Eventually we can get this conveniently available. So, you know, which now has largely been achieved with fast food chains taking it up. So my challenge is, and this is the way he's like, it's a marketing thing. I can get certain people to buy the product. I can actually convince, so still the data is moms do most of the shopping. So people who are selling Beyond Burgers are thinking especially, how do I get moms to buy these things? And they can get mom to buy these things. But what happens is when mom puts the burgers around the tables, dad and brother, it's highly, highly gendered, don't see that as their food. And that was the cultural challenge they had to overcome. And they did it with massive amounts of advertising, talking about vegan athletes and demonstrating you can really be an ass-kicking athlete and still eat plants. But that's, I think, what will determine it. Will people start to look at protein in a way that is more rational or emotional in a different way? Or will we continue to have that sense of like eating the muscle flesh of powerful animals? That's the best way to get protein. That's, I think, our idea right now. You know, we don't just eat any part of the animals, we eat their muscle flesh, and we like large ones have a special status, right? A cow has more status than chicken. So there's something very symbolic going on there. And I don't know if we can get past that. As individuals, sure, I see it all the time. I see people surprise me, make all sorts of changes. But whether society can get past that and make a change that will really allow these plant-based products to dominate the market, I think that's an open question. And I think that's why the cultural aspects of this are so important. In some ways, the kind of food science is already delivered. I mean, my God, we got burgers that taste like burgers that aren't made from meat. It's astonishing. The cultural challenge is much bigger, though, than that technical and scientific challenge.
And one of
Can I
the
speak to your question, Isabel?
One of the things I'd like to add to that, and this is why I so enjoy these kinds of conversations and continue to thank people who support them, is that we need to be looking at these problems from multiple perspectives, and we need multiple groups of people thinking it through, right? Because we could provide the data, so showing the data that it tastes the same way, but how do you get the story out? How do you get the marketing piece? And that's why, so for example, I've worked with Dr. Chung in Comm Studies, and one of the classes worked on food. And their whole goal was, how do you put the story together? How do you get the university to change its story? How do you get Beyond Meat to be the product that goes, this fits into our culture. It fits into our everyday life. And so one of the reasons why I really enjoy working in the interdisciplinary space on campus is we need to think about the creative ways to get that out. And I also think that your generation has a mindset to change things and to move it through. I mean, it's, if you come from the Midwest, you come from the Northeast, and it's wintertime, you eat meat and potatoes. It's just one of those things that people do because it's part of what they've always done. And now we need to shift that to say that it's okay to do different things. So I really do think that we need to be creative and think about ways of bringing it together. And I'll put in a plug for this is where advanced integration to me is the way to go, because we can do something that's exciting. Next semester, I'm teaching environmental issues with Monica Stuffed in theater, and we're going to do theater plays on climate change, a different way to get people to think about climate change. We could do that for food. We could do ways of getting the stories out that connect to you and say, oh, this is really cool. I want to do that. And that's how we start changing the community response rather than the individual response.
Thank you.
All right, so I think, I want to draw everyone's attention, there's a lot of really good information and resources in the chat if you haven't had a chance to look at that yet. And I think we have time for 2 more questions here. So Bridget Crowley.
Hi, I just had a question just from an objective and non-political standpoint, but do you think the increase in climate change over the past few years has related to a president who has doubts about climate change? Or do you think it would be the same regardless of who our president was?
I'll try to answer that in a non-political way. That's going to be hard. Look, what we've done is we've changed all the regulations, and saying that changing regulations is a good thing is really going to make things different. So it actually turns out, if you look at the data, that we have reduced our carbon emissions, but that's because of all the stuff that was done before. If we continue in the direction we are now, it's going to get much worse, and we're not going to be. You may hear some things going on in the press or in debates that say that we have the most beautiful, clearest, best water and best air in the world, and that's just pure bullshit. We are 27th in the world. We are behind developing countries when it comes to our environment right now. Is there a political impact? Absolutely, and the reason is not so much the politics, that's an issue, is the fact that we're back to talking about the system. The system is being led in a financial direction incorrectly. And I mean that in the sense that if you actually talk to people who have looked at sustainable supply chains and companies that are successful right now, that are incorporating sustainability in their planning, they're not only doing better for the planet, they're doing better for their bottom line, right? And so one of the big aspects we can do is talk about leaders, so business leaders and political leaders, and point out that the advantage of having clean air and clean water for everybody, no matter what your politics are, and by having a planet that's actually going to do better than in the long run, should be an apolitical conversation. It's become political, but it shouldn't be, because it should be a human right to want to have a clean planet. And I will tell you, having had a project that worked with many businesses, there are some that were somewhat skeptical about the science, but when they realized that doing the right thing also helped them as a company and elevated their profile because they were doing the right thing for the planet. So yeah, there's a problem with the politics, but we just need to continue to push because we should be the leader as a country. We're not, but we really ought to be because we have the power and the people to want to make it right. So USD is doing its part. We are taking a lead in many things, and we're going to need the students and the faculty and the staff to support the efforts that we're putting together in the next few years.
Great. And we will take the last question from Alex.
Hi, this is kind of, well, a question for both, but mostly Professor Gross. Do you think that I've taken a lot of like biotech classes, and we've done a lot of studies into the effects of like GMOs and the possibilities of how greatly they can decrease the amount of water and land needed to even produce things like almonds that require incredible amounts of water to produce. And if we were more open as a culture to accepting genetically modified plants, which the science again shows there's no negative health effects in eating those, but like if that was more common, do you think that would be a big way to combat water issues and then eventually climate change?
Yeah, thanks for that. In certain contexts, it could be quite important, but I think we tend to massively overestimate what these kind of interventions can do. And they're often just not the only opportunity. We're often why are we often talking about developing something new, something that's probably going to be owned by particular companies to address problems for which we have other solutions? And depending on the particular environment we're talking about. So what I would say in terms of public acceptance of genetically engineered organisms, honestly, whether they're plants or animals, it would be great if that were a more rational discussion. We don't have a very rational discussion about that at all. People are a little freaked out by them. But what I've observed is there are forms of genetic engineering that are legal, for example, in the poultry industry. They don't involve gene splicing, so I don't want to give you a confusion there. But they have other techniques which never existed. These techniques really began mostly in the 70s in the poultry industry that radically modify the chicken genome in ways that worry me. And I think have a lot to do with, it's a much more speculative, I don't know how speculative it is. The fact that chicken factories are such a major vector for new diseases is related in part to their genetic uniformity and their weak immune systems, which is directly related to these breeding practices I'm referring to. So that would be the kind of link. So we don't call that genetic engineering publicly, and nobody's worried about it, though I think it's pretty clear there's major ramifications. I've never really had that disputed when I've walked it through with technical experts. And then other forms of genetic engineering, which are truly innocent and that we truly understand, are not being allowed because there's just this broad attitude. So I want to totally acknowledge that it would be better if people could respond to the technology and its impacts rather than these kinds of words, which aren't even applied in an even way. If you look at the USDA definition of genetic engineering, it's insanely broad, and it basically pretty much includes traditional breeding. Just like you have to be a little bit more than traditional breeding, and you'll fit within their definition. So it's a powerful thing, but I at least just don't really think these technological solutions are needed. What I see is you have small farmers who are already far more productive per acre than big farmers. What we don't have is a system that allows many small farmers to function. Right? We just have a system that doesn't support that. In countries where that's been done, what you've ended up with is high levels of efficiency without the industrialization. So I think that the current enormous range of techniques, all the ones that have been developed in modernity, are more than enough in terms of a basket of techniques. And I'm very suspicious when we're quickly leaping to those problems. Where I would be more friendly to genetic engineering is where you have people working in a particular context, trying to solve a particular problem. And they find, okay, this is the right animal, this is working, but this animal's getting sick at rates that are too much. Or there's some very discrete problem that we know how to modify through genetic engineering. Then I would, in general, anticipate it will have positive results. But if we go with this mindset, we're going to fix the problem, because of these numbers about greater efficiency, it tends to not work out that way in my observation. Great question though.
Just a quick comment. First of all, I think it's amazing because I think every semester I've taught environmental issues, we've had, if not a discussion, but a debate on GMOs. And I think it is important to get the proper information out because you tend to have some polarization in that topic for a variety of reasons, some good and some not. I think that the science in some ways can be very good. It is often the misapplication of science that becomes a problem. But I also think it's also that the science gets then connected to big business and decisions that are beyond what we're really talking about, right? Some of the stuff is really scary and I think it needs to be looked at carefully. You know, they've tried things like making square tomatoes so they can put them in square boxes and cut down on damage to the tomato and making it easier to transport. You know, that's kind of a weird thing to have a square tomato, but if there are some things that are potentially going to be advantageous, like actual natural hybridization has been advantageous over time, I think what we're running into, however, is that we have different worlds making decisions, right? You have a business decision that's driving it. You take Monsanto, for example, that's driving policy. And so it's actually obliterating the good and bad science. It's not even allowing the science, you know, can't even see the data that's there. So we have something in the system that's inherently problematic for us to make the proper decisions. If we get to see the data and realize there really is very little impact, great, let's move with that because we can help things out. The Golden Rice Project, for example, helped people in developing countries get some of the vitamin D and vitamin A that they needed as an important source of food. I lived in Mexico for 8 months and they had vitamin D and vitamin C to the tortillas so that people could buy inexpensive food and get an additional vitamin. There are ways of doing it right, but what we really need is transparency in the system so that we can actually make the proper decisions, eliminate the ones that are dangerous, and support the ones that can actually be helpful, both for people as well as for the planet.
Great. Well, thank you so much to everyone for coming. And I just want to highlight a comment in the chat. So Dean Norton is asking about creative titles for if students have any ideas for science lab courses, similar to like the design of coffee, the engineering course. If you have any ideas for titles, if you want to throw those in the chat, or you could email them to me, and I'd be happy to pass them along. So thank you all for attending today. I hope you'll be back next week for our fourth and final session on extinction narratives. We will not leave on a totally pessimistic note, but we want to sort of explore that part of the climate crisis as well. So we have two special guests coming from outside of the university to share some film art and scholarship around extinction narratives with us next week. So please join us same time, same place. And we look forward to seeing you then.